The thing that bothered Garrett Voss most, before any of the rest of it, was the quiet. Not the ordinary quiet of a central Nebraska night, which had its own texture and population. The distant yip of coyotes working the creek drainage, the dry percussion of crickets in the roadside grass, the occasional low protest of cattle shifting weight in the far pasture. That quiet was full. He knew it the way he knew the sound of a pump rod pulling smooth versus pulling wrong. The night of September 4th started without any of that. He stepped outside at 11:08 to check the water pump on the stock tank, and the land was sealed. Not sleeping. Sealed. He stood on the porch step for a moment and listened the way a man listens when an engine he knows has gone unexpectedly silent, patient and alert, waiting for the sound that would explain the absence. Nothing came. Garrett was 44 years old. He had worked the Voss property outside of Callaway his whole adult life. The same 1,800 acres of mixed rangeland and hay ground his grandfather had broken. He did not read weather wrong. He did not startle at coyotes or mistake a whitetail for something it wasn't. His neighbors would have told you the same thing. Wade Prochaska, who ran cattle 2 miles north, once said that if Garrett Voss told you the sky was green, you'd better walk outside and look, because Garrett Voss did not embellish. He was the kind of man who wrote fuel consumption numbers in a worn pocket notebook because he wanted data, not impressions. He had a wife, Lena, and a daughter 6 months old named Clara, who slept in a second-hand crib in the back bedroom, with a monitor clipped to the changing table rail. He checked the pump. The float was riding fine, tank 3/4 full. He stood at the tank for a moment with his headlamp off, just listening. The silence sat on the whole yard like a hand pressed flat. He went back inside. The gravel pit road ran along the eastern edge of the property, a county maintenance track that serviced the aggregate operation 1.5 miles to the south. Voss Ag sat on a slight rise to the west of that road, separated by a 2-strand electric fence and a shelter belt of aging cottonwoods that ran roughly north-south. The pit itself had been inactive for 2 years. The county had let the contract expire, and the equipment was pulled out, leaving a worked-out depression maybe 40 feet deep and 200 yards wide, full of standing water in wet years and cracked alkali clay in dry ones. This had been a dry summer. The access road was still graded regularly, one of those low-use county tracks that got a blade run twice a year, whether it needed it or not, which meant it was flat and clear and offered nothing to stop a vehicle or a person from using it at any hour. Garrett had never thought much about that. Farms sit beside roads. That is how farms work. He went to bed at 11:42. Lena was already asleep. Clara had gone down at 9 and was good for 4 hours. And then she would want feeding, and then she would sleep until morning. That was the pattern they had worked out over the last 6 weeks, the one that let them both get through a day without their hands shaking. He listened to her breathe for a moment through the monitor on the nightstand, that particular small lung sound, steady and unlabored, and closed his eyes. The monitor woke him at 2:09, not Clara, something else. He was sitting up before he fully understood why, the way the body sometimes acts, while the brain is still assembling the situation. The monitor was live and quiet, Clara's breathing still audible in its soft background hiss. But underneath it, at the floor of the audio, there was something else. A low frequency, almost below register. He thought vibration. He thought motor. Then it stopped, and he realized it hadn't sounded like any motor he knew. His neck was tight. He sat in the dark and waited for it to come again, and it didn't. He put his feet on the floor. He was in jeans and a t-shirt before he was fully decided. He took the Mossberg from the closet, his habit on any night investigation, no different from taking a flashlight, just a tool, and went to the kitchen window first. The yard was clear as far as the flood lamp reached, which was about 40 feet in any direction. The shelter belt was dark. He moved to the mudroom window which faced east toward the gravel road and looked out across the yard and the fence line into the tree line. Nothing. He stood there for 4 minutes. He knew it was 4 minutes because he looked at his phone twice. Nothing moved. The silence was still wrong. The crickets had not come back, but there was nothing to see. He put the shotgun on the kitchen table and went to check the doors. Back door locked. Front door locked. Both ground floor windows seated. He stood in the hallway outside the bedroom where Lena was sleeping and looked at the door to Clara's room, which was cracked 2 inches as always, and listened. The monitor on the nightstand continued its soft relay. He could hear his daughter breathing. He went back to bed at 2:27 and did not sleep well. In the morning he told Lena what had woken him. She listened with her coffee cup held in both hands and looked at him the way she sometimes looked at him when she was deciding whether he needed to hear a gentle correction or whether she should just wait. "Probably a truck on the county road," she said. "Low gear going past the pit." "Maybe," he said. "You don't think so?" "No truck I know sounds like that." She nodded once. She had grown up in Broken Bow, 15 miles east, and she had been on this land long enough to know its sounds. She didn't dismiss him. She also didn't press. They finished their coffee and went to work. That day, Garrett ran fence on the south quarter, replacing 3 rotten posts in a stretch that was due before winter. He loaded the post driver and the spare posts in the flatbed before breakfast and was at the south line by 7:30. It was the kind of work his body knew how to do without supervision. Set the driver over the post, run the ram, check the plumb, tamp the base, move down the line. He kept the radio off. He wanted to hear the land. The morning was normal. Meadowlarks worked the fence line ahead of him, which was right for September. A red-tailed hawk made 3 passes over the short grass pasture to the north, which was right. The cattle in the south pasture moved toward the tank at their usual time, in their usual order, the old brindle cow with the torn ear going last as always. He watched all of it, and it was all correct. The gravel road sat quiet, white in the morning light. A half-mile of flat, alkali-crushed stone that went straight south and bent out of sight at the section rise. He kept finding himself looking at it. A county pickup went by around 10, trailing a small dust plume. The driver lifted a hand as he passed without slowing. Nothing else came down that road all morning. He finished the last 2 posts before noon and drove the 4-wheeler back to the shop and put the post driver away on its rack. He washed his hands at the outdoor spigot. The water was still warm from the pipes. He stood there with his hands under the flow and looked at the shelter belt over the top of the equipment yard fence. On his way back through the yard, he noticed the dog, a border collie mix named Soot they'd had for 7 years, sitting pressed against the shop door with her ears flat. Not doing anything dramatic, just sitting there with her ears folded back and her eyes on the shelter belt. Soot was a working dog, always moving, always running the perimeter or checking on Garrett or following the four-wheeler to the gate. She did not sit pressed against a wall. "What's your problem?" he said, not really asking. She looked at him and then back at the trees. He stood and looked at the shelter belt for a while. It was just trees. The cottonwoods were big and widely spaced, second-growth stuff. The kind of thin shelter belt that cut wind without fully blocking sight lines. He could see the fence line through them clearly, and beyond that the gravel road white and flat in the afternoon light. A magpie worked the ditch line along the road, hopping, stopping, hopping again. Normal. Everything visible was normal. But the dog wouldn't come when he called her in. He called twice, and she looked at him both times and did not move. He got her water bowl from the shop and filled it at the spigot and set it near her. She didn't look at the bowl. He went inside to eat and came back out an hour later, and she was still in the same position. He checked the shelter belt again from the yard. Nothing in the trees that he could see. He walked to the fence line and looked through the cottonwoods and saw the gravel road and the open flat beyond it, and the distant tree line along the creek bottom to the east. Empty. He came back, and Soot watched him cross the yard and settle back into her press against the shop wall. And he could not think of a single reason that a dog who knew this land and these sounds should look that way, and the absence of a reason was its own kind of information. The second night was September 5th. Garrett stayed up until 1 a.m., reading well reports at the kitchen table, not specifically watching but aware, the way you get aware of something without deciding to be. At 12:40 he went to the mudroom window and looked out at the shelter belt for about a minute. Clear. He went to bed. At 3:41 he was fully awake, and this time he understood immediately why. The sound came through the wall of the house, as much as through the air, a bass vibration, low and slow, with a secondary layer on top of it that was harder to characterize. Not a growl the way a dog growls, not a mechanical sound. Two registers working at the same time, the low one felt in the chest and the high one heard in the ears, and together they produced something that did not belong to any category he had. He lay still for 6 seconds. Lena was awake beside him. He could tell by her breathing. "That's not a truck," she said. "No." He was up. He took the Mossberg and the flashlight. He did not turn on any interior lights. Some instinct he couldn't have explained kept him from lighting the windows. He went to the mudroom window and looked toward the shelter belt and the road, and at first he saw nothing. And then he saw the eyes. They were in the tree line, roughly where the third cottonwood stood from the south corner. 2 points of amber-yellow light, close together. Maybe 3 inches apart at that distance, which meant at actual distance they were wider than that. They were high. He calibrated against the fence post he knew stood at 6 feet, and the eyes were above it. Well above it. He didn't move. The eyes didn't move either. They held steady, which was wrong. Animals moved their eyes when you watched them. These eyes were watching back. Then they were gone. Not blinking out, not moving laterally, just gone between 1 second and the next, as though whatever held them had simply stepped back, and the trees absorbed the rest. He stood at the window for 20 minutes. He could hear Lena in the bedroom, hear her getting up, hear her voice low and tight when she checked the monitor. Clara was asleep and fine. Lena came to the mudroom doorway in her robe. "What did you see?" she said. Eyes in the trees. Eyes. High up, over the fence line. She didn't say anything for a moment. How high? 8 feet, maybe more. He heard her breathing change. She stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, and he could see her face in the thin light from the yard lamp, and she was not dismissing it. You call someone, she said. I'll call the county in the morning. Tonight there's nothing to tell them. She looked at the window. We're locking the bedroom window. Already thinking it, he said. He went outside at first light with a flashlight and a tape measure. He walked the fence line along the shelter belt and looked for sign. He found it at the third cottonwood from the south corner, just as he'd estimated. The soft ground inside the fence, where the cottonwood roots had loosened the dirt, held an impression. He crouched down and looked at it for a long time before he measured. It was roughly oval, wider than long, with what appeared to be individual toe impressions at the front and a heel compression at the back. The length was 14 3/4 inches. The width across the ball was 9 inches. He measured twice. He photographed it with his phone and then stood back and looked at the tree. There were marks on the bark at shoulder height, which on the cottonwood was high up. Parallel scratches in sets of 3, the kind you'd expect from something gripping the bark. He measured the scratch cluster from the ground, 8 feet 4 inches. He photographed that too. He called the county sheriff's non-emergency line from the farm office at 8:15 that morning. The dispatcher was polite and took his information and said she'd pass it along. He asked if there was a deputy who could come out and look at the physical sign. She said she'd pass it along. He called the Nebraska Game and Parks office in Broken Bow at 9. The person who answered said they could have someone look at the track photos if he emailed them, and gave him an address and suggested it might be a bear. He said he understood there were no established bear populations in Custer County. The person said they would look at the photos. He never heard back. He went back to work. The track bothered him not because it was large, though it was, but because of what wasn't there. He was good at reading sign. He had been tracking whitetails and coyotes on this property for 23 years, and whatever left that impression had left only one visible track in the soft soil. Not a stride sequence, not an approach trail. One track at the fence line, which meant whatever made it had come to the fence and stopped there and stood. He walked the east fence line for a 1/4 mile in each direction and found nothing else. No disturbed grass, no broken stems in the cracked soil at the road edge. No other impression. Something had walked to that fence line without leaving the approach. He checked the shelter belt from the inside, walking the full north-south length of it, and found one other thing. A patch of fur caught on the lower strand of barbed wire at the south end of the belt, just above ground level. Guard hairs, he thought, coarse and long, dark brown to near black, several inches in length. Not cattle hair, not horse hair, not coyote. He put them in a Ziploc bag without touching them directly, using a stick to work them off the wire. He set the bag on the shop workbench and stood under the fluorescent light and looked at the hairs for a long time. He had spent enough years around animals to know hair the way a mechanic knows steel. Deer hair was hollow, kinked, soft enough to bend between the fingers. Coyote guard hair was coarse, but short, banded dark and light. Cattle hair varied, but the texture was always recognizable. Lanolin and looseness. These hairs were none of those. They were long. The longest measured close to 4 inches, and straight from root to tip with no banding at all. The color was a deep brown black at the base, and did not lighten toward the end the way most wildlife coat hair did. The shaft was stiff and uniform. He flexed one between his fingers, and it did not bend easily. He set it back in the bag and zipped it. He got a second bag from the drawer and double-bagged the sample and labeled it with the date and location in carpenter pencil on a strip of masking tape. He put the bag in the chest freezer in the shop, between a package of venison from last November and a plastic container of Lena's chili. Then he stood in the shop and looked at his photographs on his phone for the third time that morning. The track, the scratch height, the parallel gouges in the cottonwood bark. He had 14 photographs. He had a measurement and a sample, and an approximate location and a time window. He set his phone face down on the workbench and thought about what the rational explanation was. That night, September 6th, he moved a camp cot into the living room and slept there with the Mossberg and the flashlight and his boots on. Lena did not argue. She took the bedroom with Clara and locked the window and wedged the closet rod under the bedroom door handle, and that was the arrangement they arrived at, without much discussion, because there wasn't much to discuss. He set an alarm for 1 a.m. and for 3 a.m. Before he lay down, he walked the interior perimeter of the house in the dark, checking each window by feel. Mudroom window, locked. Kitchen window over the sink, locked. The small bathroom window on the north wall, which was old and swelled with humidity and sometimes didn't seat properly, locked. Rod in place. Living room windows, both seated. He went to the back bedroom door and pressed his hand flat against it and listened. The soft sound of Lena's breathing. And below that, from the monitor on the nightstand, the small lung rhythm of Clara sleeping. He stood there for a moment with his palm on the door and then went back to the cot. The house settled and creaked, the way it always settled and creaked. He cataloged each sound automatically. The south wall contracting as the night dropped below 50, the refrigerator cycling on, the copper pipe in the bathroom wall clicking twice as the water pressure balanced. He had lived in this house for 19 years. He knew every sound it made. At 1 o'clock, the yard was empty. At 3 o'clock, the yard was empty. At 3:29, Soot started making a sound he had never heard from her in 7 years. Not barking. A low, compressed whine, repetitive, coming from the mudroom where she slept. He was off the cot and at the window before she finished the third repetition. The shelter belt was dark. The yard lamp lit the near ground and ended at the tree line. He scanned left to right and caught nothing on the pass. On the return scan, he caught the eye shine, and this time it was not in the trees. It was at the fence line itself, in the gap where the south gate stood. Low this time. Not standing, crouching or sitting or whatever configuration put those two amber points, 18 inches off the ground. The spacing was the same as before, 3 inches apart at distance, which meant wide. He watched it watched him. For somewhere between 30 seconds and a minute, and he was aware that his time sense was not reliable in those moments. Nothing moved. Then the eye shine rose. Not quickly, a slow ascent, the way something large stands up from a resting position. And the height of it kept going. Past the top fence wire, past the gate post, past the level, where it should have stopped for anything he knew. He put the yard lamp's 6-foot post marker against it, and the eyes cleared that line by 1.5 feet at minimum. By a foot and then the shape of it was briefly in the yard lamp's edge. Not lit, just outlined. The upper register of something standing in the gap between the shelter belt and the near dark of the yard. broad shoulders, a long neck, a head that sat forward on the neck rather than upright, and height enough that the cottonwood's lowest branches were at the level of its ear. He saw it for 4 seconds. He did not look away once. Then it moved back into the shelter belt, and the eye shine disappeared, and the dark where it had been was just dark. Soot had pressed herself to the corner of the mudroom and gone silent. He called Lena's name once, not loudly. She was in the doorway in 30 seconds. He told her what he'd seen. She stood with her hand on the door frame and her face was white. "How tall?" she said. 8.5. 9. It was crouching some still. She looked out the window. "We need to go to my mother's. I'm not leaving the property. Garrett, I know what I'm asking. I know." She looked at him and then at the window and then back at him. He knew that look. It was the one that meant she was deciding whether to push, and he was grateful, and something else he couldn't name when she pressed her lips together and said, "Then you need to find out what that thing is." He already had the Ziploc bag on the bench. He already had the photographs on his phone. The next morning he drove to Broken Bow and printed the track photographs at the drugstore, 8x10 full resolution, and took them to the county extension office, which was not the right place for it, but it was the only official office in town where someone might look at them seriously. The woman at the desk looked at the photographs and said she didn't know what that was. He drove to a retired game warden named Elmer Schuster, who lived 3 miles east of Callaway and who had worked the Loop River country for 22 years before his hip gave out. Garrett had known Elmer his whole life. The man had taught a hunter education course that Garrett's father had made him take at 14, and he had walked Garrett's property twice over the years when deer were dying on the south quarter and they couldn't locate the cause. He was a large, quiet man who moved carefully because of the hip and kept his opinions at the back of the room until they were fully assembled. Elmer's kitchen table was square and old and covered in an oilcloth print that had faded to nothing. He set a cup of coffee in front of Garrett without asking and sat across from him and took the printed photographs one at a time and looked at each one for a full half-minute before setting it down. He did not say anything while he looked. He looked at the fur sample in the bag, holding it up to the window light and turning it slowly. He went back to the track photograph. He took his own reading glasses off and put them on the table, and looked at the photograph without them, then put them back on. He set his coffee cup down and measured the printed track with a small ruler he produced from his shirt pocket and did the scale math in his head, working his lips slightly. He looked at Garrett across the table. "Where is this?" he said. "My east fence line, along the gravel pit road." Elmer was quiet for a moment. "What kind of sign at the bark?" Garrett showed him the scratch photos. Elmer looked at those too. He scrolled back and forth between the scratch image and the full tree image twice. He set the phone down and folded his hands on the table with a precise, settling motion, like a man putting a tool down after he'd confirmed it was the wrong one for the job. "I've got nothing for you," Elmer said. "I mean that. The track shape is wrong for bear. You've got no claw extension in the toe impressions, and the heel is wrong. The scratch height makes no sense for any animal I can name. I don't know what that fur is. I am not going to guess." "That's what I figured," Garrett said. "Has it come at the house?" "Fence line, south gate. It's been watching." Elmer was quiet a second time. He looked at the window and then at Garrett. "You've got a baby in that house." "I know it." "All right," Elmer said. He got up from the table with the careful effort of a man who had learned not to rush the hip and went to his back room. Garrett heard him moving things around on a shelf. He came back with a spotlight, the kind you plug into a truck cab's lighter socket, 12 volt, with a 3 million candle power beam in a ribbed housing the size of a dinner plate. He set it on the table between them. You want to see it when it comes back. You need to see it all the way. He paused. You want me to come out there? Garrett looked at him. Elmer was 67 and walked with a cane he'd left leaning against the counter. No, he said, thank you. Elmer nodded once. He looked at the photograph still spread on the table. He did not say what he thought he was looking at. Either he didn't know or he had decided that naming it would not help. Garrett understood both reasons. He gathered the photographs and stood up. Elmer walked him to the door and stood on the porch step, while Garrett put the spotlight in the truck cab. You call me, Elmer said. Whatever time. Garrett said he would. He drove back to the farm. Lena had packed a bag for Clara and had the bag by the front door. She did not say anything about it. The bag sat there and they both knew what it meant, and neither of them said it. He set up the spotlight on the mudroom windowsill that evening, clamping it to the sill frame with a woodworking clamp so it would hold a fixed angle. He tested the beam. It cut the shelter belt cleanly, lit the fence line from the south gate to 30 yards north. He zeroed it at the gap in the fence and left it there. He scattered flour in a 4-foot ring around the south gate post at dusk, working with a coffee can of baking flour, the kind of sign-checking technique he would have used for coyotes going over a fence. He measured out the ring diameter and photographed it before full dark. Then he came inside and waited. September 7th. He was on the cot at 11. He did not try to sleep. At 12:47, Soot made the compressed whine again. 2 repetitions, and then went completely silent. He hit the spotlight. The beam caught the south gate and the shelter belt on either side and the fence line in a 40-foot spread. The gate was clear. The flour ring was disturbed on the east side, not footprint disturbed, but the fine top layer blown outward in a slow arc, as though something large had exhaled downward through the fence wire from outside. He scanned the beam slowly right into the shelter belt. It was between the second and third cottonwoods from the south corner, standing, facing the house. He had 3 seconds of the beam on it before it moved, and those 3 seconds were enough. The scale of it required a moment to process. The cottonwood it stood beside was a mature tree, and the top of his fence post nearest to it cleared roughly 6 feet. The thing's shoulder was at the level of the fence post top, not the top of its head. The shoulder. It stood on 2 legs with a forward lean in the spine, the way you'd describe a man leaning into a headwind, and the head was large and sat on a thick neck that merged into the shoulder mass without much of a column. The face was long, not flat like a man's face, long, with a pronounced forward extension at the jaw and nose. The ears were up and pointed. The forearms were long, longer than proportional, and the hands, or paws, or whatever they were, hung below mid-thigh with the arms at rest. The coat was dark, guard hairs long enough to move slightly in the night air, and the eye shine when the beam caught it was not red, not yellow. It was a deep gold that held the light and gave it back at a 3-second delay, still glowing briefly when the beam was already moving. It did not flinch at the spotlight. It turned its head toward the beam and did not flinch. Then it stepped backward, 1 step, and the shelter belt folded around it. He sat in the mudroom for 30 minutes with the spotlight in his hand and the Mossberg across his knees, and the yard empty and silent. His hands were not shaking, which surprised him. Something had settled in him during those 3 seconds that was not calm. It was the thing that was left after. Something you had been uncertain about became certain. He knew what he had. He did not have a name for it, and he did not need one. He had a measurement, an impression in the soil, a bag of fur, and now a visual accounting delivered in flat detail that he would have been able to repeat to anyone who asked. That was enough. He went to the flower ring at first light. The disturbance on the east side was what he'd seen through the beam. Inside the fence, in the dirt that had been softened by recent irrigation runoff at the base of the post, there was a second impression. Partial, not full. The front third of a track. Just the toe spread and the ball of the foot. 4 toes, visible, widely spaced. No claw extension at the end of the impressions. The spread at the widest point was 9 1/4 inches. He photographed it and measured it and straightened up and looked at the gravel pit road. The road was empty. Morning light came flat across the alkali flat to the east, the kind of thin September light that lit everything without warming it. The pit access road ran south, white and straight, and where it curved out of sight at the rise, there was nothing, no vehicle, no dust, no movement. He went inside. Lena was up with Clara at the kitchen table, the baby propped against her arm with a bottle. Lena looked at him. He sat down across from her and put his phone on the table and showed her the photograph from the spotlight. The dark shape between the cottonwoods, the eyes that held the beam and gave it back gold. She looked at the photograph for a long time. Clara made a small sound and worked the bottle. "Okay," Lena said. He called the Nebraska State Patrol non-emergency line that morning and reported an unidentified large animal making repeated approaches to a livestock property and residence. The trooper who took his information was professional and thorough and said he would log it and they could send a unit out to take a report if he wanted. Garrett said yes. The unit arrived that afternoon, a young trooper named Kraus, who walked the fence line with him, looked at the track impressions, looked at the scratch marks on the cottonwood, and wrote everything down in a notebook. He was respectful and precise, and he did not offer an identification. He said the dimensions were outside anything in his training. He said he would file the report, and someone from the wildlife division would follow up, and he gave Garrett a case number. That had been 11 days ago now. No follow-up had come. Garrett had not stopped checking. He had the spotlight mounted permanently in the mudroom window now, the woodworking clamp seated through a hole. He had drilled in the sill frame with a 1/4-inch bit. He had checked the flower ring and replaced it every day, working from the same coffee can, measuring the diameter with a framing square so it was consistent night to night. He had found 2 more partial impressions along the south fence line, each separated by a stride length he could not replicate without a 10-foot step, each photographed and added to the folder on his phone that now held 41 images. He had found the fur again. Different strands, caught on the middle barbed wire, 3 posts north of the gate, as though whatever left them had come along the fence line from north to south during the night of the 9th. He bagged those too and labeled them and put them in the freezer with the first sample. He had placed a hardwired trail camera on the south corner post on the 10th, angled at the gate, running off a deep cycle battery, in a waterproof case. He had checked the playback each morning and found nothing on nights 10 and 11. Motion triggers, yes, but whatever set them off moved through the frame too fast or too close to resolve. Night event 12 produced a frame sequence at 2:44 a.m. that showed a pale blur in the lower right of the image, dense and unstructured, which he had enlarged on his phone and laptop and could not interpret. It was not a deer's side, it was not a coyote. It was a section of something very close to the lens, pressed nearly against it, which would have required something to step to within inches of the post and lean down to the camera's level. He kept coming back to that, leaning down to the camera's level. On the morning of September 12th, he found the camera turned 45 degrees on its mount, not fallen, not displaced by wind. The clamp was tight and the mount undamaged. Turned, with the lens now facing the field interior rather than the road. Turned with deliberateness, as though something had examined it and redirected it. He sat with that fact for a long time in the shop before he accepted what it meant. Then he remounted the camera on its original angle and tightened the clamp an extra half turn and came inside for breakfast and did not say anything to Lena about the camera. She had her bag by the door. He had not asked her to take it back. He was aware that the bag was a form of argument that did not require words, and that she was right to make it, and that his inability to leave was not something he could explain in a way that would satisfy either of them. The farm was 1,800 acres of ground his grandfather had broken with a rented tractor and a surveyor's rod in 1947, and the house they were in was the second house built on that ground, and the gravel pit road had been named on county maps since before his father was born. This was not sentiment. It was simply that a man does not leave his land because something is watching it, because the logic of leaving ends at the property line and does not continue to wherever the thing watching might follow. On the evening of September 15th, the 16th night since he had first stood on the porch and heard the land go silent, Garrett Voss stood at the mudroom window with the spotlight in his right hand, and the Mossberg leaned against the wall within reach and looked at the south gate and the shelter belt and the white line of the county road beyond it. Clara was in the crib. Lena had gone to bed at 9, but he did not think she was sleeping. The dog was pressed to her corner. The sky was overcast. No moon. The yard lamp making its usual 40-foot island of light in the surrounding dark. He had replaced the flower ring that afternoon, fresh from a new 5-pound bag, and had added a second ring 10 feet further north, along the fence line at the post opposite the third cottonwood. 2 rings now. He had also driven a fresh 6-inch deck screw partway into the outside sill of the bedroom window and wrapped 12 inches of wire around it and the window latch, so that even if the latch were somehow worked from outside, the wire would hold the frame. He had done this while Lena was feeding Clara in the kitchen and had not shown it to her afterward. She had not asked what the sound of the drill was. She was past asking about the preparations, which was its own kind of answer. He stood at the window and listened to the land outside. The crickets had been back for 4 nights now. The absence always returned eventually, always came back, as though testing the boundary, and then went away again. And this was the pattern he had come to recognize. When they stopped, something was there. When they came back, it had withdrawn to a distance he couldn't measure. Tonight they were still going, thin and dry in the late September air, which meant whatever had been watching the fence line was either absent or far back. He preferred to know which. He had been thinking about the camera, about the angle it had been turned to. The new angle aimed the lens at the gap in the shelter belt to the north of the south gate. At the fence section, he had not been watching. The section directly opposite the northwest corner of the house. The corner where the back bedroom window was. He moved to the living room and looked at the northwest corner from the interior. The window was locked, the latch seated. He stood there for a moment, and then he went back to the mudroom. At 11:52, Soot made no sound at all. She went from lying in her corner to standing with every hair on her back raised and her mouth closed and her eyes fixed at the mudroom window. Garrett hit the spotlight. The south gate was empty. He moved the beam north. The amber gold eye shine was at the shelter belt's north end, the opposite end from where it had stood before, 50 yards further along the fence line from the gate. Closer to the house, oriented not toward the gate, but toward the house wall, toward the back corner, the bedroom corner, the window that was above where Clara slept. He stood at the mudroom window with the spotlight on it and watched it stand there watching the corner of his house, and the distance from that spot to the bedroom window was 60 feet, and the measurement from here to there was 60 feet. And the animal, or whatever it was that stood in the darkness at the edge of his shelter belt, knew something about the layout of this farm that he had not taught it. He set the spotlight on the sill, fixed on its position, and picked up the Mossberg. He stood in the hallway between the mudroom and the back bedroom with the gun at his side, and the spotlight beam visible through the mudroom window casting a thin secondary light down the hall. He could hear Clara in the monitor. He could hear Lena's breathing from behind the bedroom door, which told him she was awake and listening. The yard outside was quiet, with that particular flat silence that had replaced the normal sounds of September 8 nights ago and had not given them back. And 60 feet of open yard between the shelter belt and the bedroom window. He put his hand on the bedroom door handle and pushed it open an inch and said to his wife, low and level, the kind of voice he used when the situation was already defined, "Come take the baby to the bathroom and lock the door." He heard her sit up. He heard her cross to the crib without a word. He closed the bedroom door and walked to the back of the hallway where the exterior wall met the floor and sat down against it with his back to the wall and the shotgun across his knees, facing the direction of the window. The monitor on the nightstand reached him even through the door. Clara's small breathing, soft and steady, the most ordinary sound in the world. Outside, past 60 feet of dark yard, and a 2-strand electric fence and a line of cottonwoods, the spotlight held its beam on a spot in the shelter belt where nothing stood anymore. He had already looked. He could see the beam from here. The beam lit empty trees, an empty fence wire, and the white flat of the county road beyond it. The gravel pit road running straight south into a dark he could not see the end of. Dawn was 4 hours and 11 minutes away. He did not move.